It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. This infamous line from Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince has echoed through 5 centuries, unsettling readers with its cold pragmatism. But what many miss is that behind this statement lies a profound psychological insight about human nature and power that challenges our modern worship of empathy as an unalloyed good. Machiavelli wasn't merely a cynical political strategist. He was one of history's most clear-eyed observers of power dynamics and human behavior. His observations about empathy, or what he would have called excessive compassion, contain insights that most contemporary discussions of leadership and social relations deliberately avoid. The uncomfortable truth Machiavelli recognized is that empathy, while celebrated as a virtue in our culture, often functions as a psychological vulnerability that can be weaponized against those who embrace it without qualification. This insight wasn't born from nihilism, but from a ruthlessly honest assessment of historical patterns and human psychology. What makes Machiavelli's perspective so disturbing and so valuable is its recognition that power operates according to laws as inexorable as those of physics. Just as gravity doesn't care about your intentions when you step off a cliff, the dynamics of power don't accommodate wishful thinking about human nature. Empathy, when misapplied or untempered by strategic thinking, doesn't elevate leadership, it undermines it. The question isn't whether Machiavelli was right or wrong in some absolute moral sense. The question is whether his observations accurately describe the world as it exists, rather than as we wish it to be. And if we're honest with ourselves, the evidence suggests that his insights about empathy's darker side remain as relevant today as they were in Renaissance Florence. The empathy trap. When Machiavelli wrote, "Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions," he wasn't merely being cynical. He was identifying a fundamental vulnerability in human psychology that makes empathetic people particularly susceptible to manipulation. The empathy trap works like this. Those who pride themselves on understanding and feeling others' emotions become predictable in their reactions. Their responses can be anticipated and exploited precisely because they follow consistent patterns driven by emotional reactions rather than strategic calculation. Consider how Machiavelli describes the downfall of overly compassionate rulers. The way men live is so far removed from the way they ought to live that anyone who abandons what is for what should be pursues his downfall rather than his preservation. This isn't just political advice. It's a psychological observation about how empathy can blind us to hard realities. The trap has 3 distinct stages. First, the empathetic person assumes others share their basic moral framework and emotional responses. Second, this assumption creates blind spots where manipulation can occur undetected. Third, when manipulation is finally recognized, the empathetic person often doubles down on compassion rather than strategic response, creating a vicious cycle. Machiavelli witnessed this pattern repeatedly in the political intrigues of his time. The ruler who hesitated to punish a betrayal out of compassion soon faced greater threats. The leader who showed mercy to enemies found that mercy used against loyal supporters. The prince who valued being loved over being feared discovered how quickly love evaporates when power wanes. Men worry less about doing an injury to one who makes himself loved than to one who makes himself feared, Machiavelli observed. This isn't because human nature is inherently evil, but because it's inherently pragmatic. When consequences are absent, behavior changes accordingly. The empathetic leader who fails to recognize this finds themselves increasingly exploited. Modern psychological research ironically confirms Machiavelli's insights. Studies show that those who score higher on empathy measures are more likely to be targeted for exploitation in negotiation settings. Their emotional responses become predictable leverage points that more strategic actors can manipulate to their advantage. The most dangerous aspect of the empathy trap is how it distorts risk assessment. Excessive empathy creates what psychologists call the identifiable victim effect, where immediate emotional concerns override more significant but less visceral considerations. The empathetic decision-maker focuses on avoiding immediate suffering rather than preventing greater harm in the future. The weakness of moral flexibility. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. This Machiavellian observation cuts to the heart of why unchecked empathy creates weakness. It generates moral flexibility precisely when principled consistency is needed. Machiavelli recognized that power requires what modern game theorists call credible commitment, the ability to bind oneself to certain courses of action even when they become temporarily uncomfortable. Empathy undermines this ability by constantly recalibrating moral calculations based on immediate emotional feedback rather than long-term strategy. Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. This statement isn't about rejecting human connection, but about understanding that governance and leadership require psychological stability that pure empathy cannot provide. The weakness manifests in three critical ways. First, empathetic leaders become inconsistent, applying different standards based on emotional proximity rather than principle. Second, this inconsistency makes their declarations and boundaries untrustworthy. Third, awareness of this untrustworthiness encourages testing behavior from those seeking advantage. Machiavelli observed this pattern in how conquering powers managed subject territories. Those who made harsh examples initially but governed justly afterward maintained stability. Those who began with conciliation but resorted to harshness when problems arose faced constant rebellion. The initial suffering prevented greater suffering later, a calculation pure empathy struggles to make. Men should be either treated generously or destroyed because they take revenge for slight injuries but cannot do so for grave ones. This insight explains why half measures born of empathy often backfire. The empathetic impulse to minimize immediate harm while still achieving objectives creates precisely the conditions that maximize resistance and resentment. Modern leadership studies confirm this Machiavellian insight. Leaders who maintain consistent standards, even when temporarily unpopular, ultimately command greater respect and cooperation than those who adjust standards based on emotional reactions. The apparent harshness of consistency creates the psychological safety of predictability. The most dangerous weakness empathy creates is the vulnerability to what game theorists call the ratchet effect. Each empathetic concession sets a new baseline from which further concessions are demanded. Without countering mechanisms, this process continues until authority is completely undermined, a pattern Machiavelli observed repeatedly in the downfall of principalities. The exploitation of compassion. Men are so constituted that they will always be grateful for compassion and faithlessness according to their needs of the moment. This Machiavellian observation identifies how empathy becomes not just a personal weakness, but a resource others learn to harvest for their own advantage. The exploitation follows predictable patterns Machiavelli documented in the political intrigues of his era. First comes the appeal to compassion through demonstrated suffering. Then the incremental expansion of requests once empathetic engagement is established. Finally, the transformation of voluntary compassion into expected obligation. Machiavelli wasn't suggesting compassion has no place in human affairs. Rather, he recognized that compassion, when divorced from strategic thinking, creates predictable vulnerabilities that will inevitably be exploited. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. This pattern appears throughout The Prince and Discourses on Livy. The ruler who shows mercy finds more crimes committed as potential wrongdoers calculate reduced consequences. The leader who forgives betrayal soon faces greater betrayals as the cost of disloyalty diminishes. The prince who prioritizes being loved discovers that love is withdrawn precisely when support is most needed. Men are less hesitant about harming someone who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared, because love is held together by a chain of obligation, which, since men are wretched creatures, is broken on every occasion in which their own interests are concerned. This observation cuts against our sentimental notions, but aligns with behavioral economics research on how people actually behave when constraints are removed. The exploitation of compassion operates through what modern psychologists call moral licensing, where an initial compassionate act creates permission for subsequent self-interest. The empathetic person extends compassion, which the recipient mentally categorizes as creating moral credit they can later spend on self-interested behavior. Machiavelli documented how this dynamic corrupted entire systems of governance. Leaders who based their authority on popular affection rather than structured incentives found themselves increasingly unable to enforce necessary but unpopular measures. The desire to be seen as compassionate gradually undermined the very order that made compassion possible. The necessity of avoiding the reputation of being mean is such that it often causes liberality to result in serious injury. This insight explains why public displays of empathy and generosity, while temporarily advantageous, create long-term vulnerabilities through escalating expectations that eventually cannot be met. The strategic alternative. Machiavelli's genius wasn't in rejecting empathy entirely, but in recognizing its proper place within a strategic framework. It is necessary for a prince to possess the nature of both the fox and the lion. This famous metaphor suggests that empathy must be balanced with strategic thinking, the cunning of the fox and the strength of the lion. The alternative to naive empathy isn't cruelty, but what might be called strategic compassion. Empathy deployed with awareness of its potential to be exploited and countered by appropriate safeguards. Machiavelli's ideal ruler understands human nature as it is while working toward outcomes that ultimately benefit the whole. A prince should seem merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, and religious, but his mind should be disposed in such a way that should it become necessary not to be so, he can become the opposite. This isn't advocating dishonesty, but psychological flexibility. The ability to override empathetic impulses when they conflict with more important considerations. The strategic approach has three components. First, empathy is used to understand others' motivations and likely responses. Second, this understanding informs the design of systems that align individual interests with collective welfare. Third, violations of these systems are met with consistent consequences regardless of emotional appeals. Machiavelli illustrated this approach through his analysis of successful rulers who maintained order not through continuous harshness, but through selective examples that established boundaries. Men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, but of more serious ones they cannot. Therefore, the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. This apparent harshness actually minimizes suffering by creating clear expectations that prevent the continuous testing of boundaries. The ruler who punishes one betrayal decisively faces fewer future betrayals than the ruler whose empathy encourages others to try their luck. The net suffering is reduced through strategic rather than tactical compassion. Modern organizational psychology confirms this Machiavellian insight. Leaders who establish clear boundaries and enforce them consistently create environments with less overall conflict than those who respond empathetically to each situation as it arises. The apparent harshness of the former creates the psychological safety of predictability. The strategic alternative requires what Machiavelli called virtù, not moral virtue in the conventional sense, but the capacity to respond appropriately to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent principles. This approach uses empathy as information rather than allowing it to become the primary driver of decision-making. The virtue of controlled empathy. The prince must consider how to avoid those things which make him hated and despised. Machiavelli recognized that complete absence of empathy creates its own vulnerabilities. The strategic approach isn't rejecting empathy entirely, but controlling its expression and application. Controlled empathy operates through what Machiavelli called economy of violence, the minimal application of force necessary to maintain order. The truly strategic leader isn't needlessly harsh, but precisely calibrates responses to create maximum psychological impact with minimum actual suffering. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see but to few to touch. This observation explains why symbolic demonstrations of both strength and compassion can be more effective than their constant application. The leader who clearly can be harsh but chooses restraint commands more respect than either the consistently harsh or consistently gentle. Machiavelli illustrated this through his analysis of Cesare Borgia's governance of Romagna. Borgia appointed a harsh administrator to restore order, allowed him to take the blame for necessary cruelties, then publicly executed him for excessive violence. This strategy aligned public perception with Borgia's interests while actually establishing more humane governance than existed previously. The controlled approach uses empathy as a calibration tool rather than a primary driver. It asks not, "What would a compassionate person do?" but what action will create the conditions for minimum suffering over time. This calculation often leads to different conclusions than immediate empathetic responses would suggest. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. This insight emphasizes how controlled empathy extends to creating systems that leverage human nature rather than fighting against it. The wise ruler doesn't expect universal virtue, but creates conditions where virtue becomes the most advantageous choice. Modern behavioral economics validates this Machiavellian approach. Systems that align individual incentives with collective welfare produce more consistent pro-social behavior than appeals to empathy alone. The apparent coldness of systematic thinking ultimately creates more reliable, compassionate outcomes than unchecked, empathetic responses. The virtue of controlled empathy manifests in three dimensions. First, it distinguishes between individuals deserving of full compassion and those requiring strategic management. Second, it recognizes when short-term harshness prevents greater long-term suffering. Third, it maintains consistency that creates psychological safety through predictability. the modern relevance. Whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past. Machiavelli's insights about empathy's vulnerabilities remain relevant because human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed since he wrote. The modern world offers new contexts, but the same basic dynamics he identified. In professional environments, excessive empathy creates what game theorists call the nice guy finish last effect. Those who prioritize empathetic responses over strategic thinking find themselves consistently exploited in negotiations, promotions, and resource allocation. Their predictable responsiveness becomes a liability rather than an asset. In international relations, Machiavelli's insights explain why empathetic overtures without credible strength behind them often fail to produce desired outcomes. Nations that signal unconditional empathy create moral hazard that encourages rather than discourages problematic behavior from actors who calculate reduced consequences. In personal relationships, unbalanced empathy creates what psychologists call emotional labor asymmetry. The person who consistently prioritizes others' feelings above strategic considerations finds themselves bearing an increasing share of relationship maintenance while receiving diminishing reciprocity. The fact is that a man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief among so many who are not virtuous. This observation explains why environments without structures to protect empathetic actors often select against them. The purely empathetic approach becomes evolutionarily disadvantageous without complementary mechanisms. The modern relevance appears most clearly in digital environments where traditional social constraints are weakened. Online interactions stripped of physical presence and community accountability create precisely the conditions Machiavelli identified as most dangerous for empathetic actors, where exploitation carries minimal consequences for exploiters. Research on online negotiation and conflict resolution confirms this Machiavellian insight. Digital environments show accelerated versions of the exploitation patterns Machiavelli documented in Renaissance politics. The physically distance combined with empathetic signals creates ideal conditions for the harvesting of compassion without reciprocity. Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands, because seeing is given to everyone, touching to few. This observation explains why modern media environments, which prioritize visual emotional appeals over deeper analysis, create particularly fertile ground for the exploitation of empathy that Machiavelli warned against. Strategic empathy for the modern world. Machiavelli's insights don't require rejecting empathy, but developing what might be called strategic empathy. Compassion deployed with awareness of human nature and power dynamics rather than naive hope. This approach treats empathy as a capability to be managed rather than an impulse to be indulged. Strategic empathy begins with Machiavelli's most fundamental insight. Men are so simple of mind and so much dominated by their immediate needs that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived. This isn't cynicism, but realism about the environment in which compassion operates. The strategic approach uses empathy as an information-gathering tool rather than a decision-making framework. It asks, "What does this emotional response tell me about the situation?" rather than, "What does this emotional response tell me to do?" This distinction preserves empathy's insights while protecting against its vulnerabilities. Machiavelli's advice suggests 3 principles for modern application. First, empathy should be paired with clear boundaries that are consistently enforced. Second, compassionate exceptions should be rare and never established as precedents. Third, systems should be designed to align others' self-interest with desired behavior rather than relying on continuous empathetic appeals. The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. This observation explains why strategic empathy often requires managing perceptions rather than just intentions. The appearance of both compassion and strength must be maintained even when immediate circumstances might suggest sacrificing one for the other. Modern leadership research confirms this Machiavellian insight. Leaders who demonstrate situational empathy while maintaining consistent standards command greater respect and cooperation than either purely empathetic or purely authoritarian approaches. The integration of these apparently contradictory qualities creates more effective leadership than either quality alone. The strategic approach recognizes what Machiavelli called necessita, the constraints reality imposes regardless of our wishes. A prudent ruler cannot and should not keep his word when such observance would be against his interests. This isn't moral relativism, but recognition that principles must sometimes adapt to circumstances while maintaining their essential purpose. Strategic empathy manifests in what modern psychologists call bounded compassion, empathy deployed within clear constraints that prevent its exploitation. This approach allows for genuine human connection without creating the vulnerabilities that pure empathy inevitably generates in competitive environments. The path forward. There is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle, than to initiate a new order of things. Machiavelli's most famous observation applies directly to the challenge of developing strategic empathy in a culture that celebrates uncritical compassion as an absolute good. The path forward isn't rejecting empathy, but developing what Machiavelli called the effectual truth, an understanding of how empathy actually functions in human systems, rather than how we wish it would function. This understanding doesn't diminish compassion, but deploys it more effectively. Strategic empathy begins with Machiavelli's fundamental insight about human nature. All men are bad and ever ready to display their vicious nature whenever they may find occasion for it. This isn't absolute but contingent. People respond to incentives and constraints rather than abstract moral principles. Empathy deployed without recognition of this reality becomes self-defeating. The practical application involves three dimensions. First, empathy must be paired with consequences that align others' self-interest with pro-social behavior. Second, compassionate exceptions must remain unpredictable rather than creating exploitable patterns. Third, systems must be designed that make virtue advantageous rather than relying on continuous moral appeals. The prince who relies upon their words, without having otherwise provided for his security, is ruined. This observation applies directly to those who rely on empathetic appeals, without complementary mechanisms to prevent exploitation. True compassion requires not just good intentions, but effective structures that protect those intentions from manipulation. Modern organizational psychology confirms this Machiavellian insight. Systems that align individual incentives with collective welfare produce more consistent pro-social behavior than appeals to empathy alone. The apparent coldness of systematic thinking ultimately creates more reliable, compassionate outcomes than unchecked empathetic responses. The path forward isn't choosing between Machiavellian calculation and human compassion, but integrating them into what might be called virtuous effectiveness, the capacity to achieve genuinely compassionate outcomes through strategic rather than merely tactical thinking. This integration doesn't compromise either quality, but enhances both. The main foundations of every state are good laws and good arms. There cannot be good laws without good arms, and where there are good arms, good laws inevitably follow. This observation applies metaphorically to empathy. Compassion without the strength to protect it inevitably becomes exploited. True empathy requires not just the desire to reduce suffering, but the capacity to create conditions where that reduction becomes sustainable. Machiavelli's final lesson is perhaps his most important. Effectiveness matters more than intention. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see but to few to touch. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are. This insight applies directly to empathy. What matters isn't feeling compassion, but creating conditions where suffering is actually minimized over time. The truly empathetic approach isn't displaying uncritical compassion in each situation, but developing the strategic capacity to create systems where compassion becomes sustainable rather than self-defeating. This requires not rejecting empathy, but elevating it from mere emotional reaction to strategic capability. Not weakening compassion, but strengthening it through the very Machiavellian insights that initially seem to contradict it.